and then we'll.
I was just starting it up.
Thank you. Thanks, Troy. Oh, are we on, Troy?
Yep, people are entering now.
Great. I'll just give it a second.
Sounds like people could, if we're not talking, at least there's some noise going so people can tell if sound is working.
Thanks, Troy. That's great. Got a good beat to it as well.
Couldn't find the one I was using for our last webinars. This is a new one.
It's a little more sedate, Troy, than the last song we used to play.
Yeah, I guess.
Let me know when we're up to speed. I'm just watching the participants' numbers. Hi, everybody. Just going to wait for a few minutes until we get everybody in to the webinar today. Numbers are climbing as we speak here.
We had quite a few people sign up, so we'll give it a minute.
Hey, Troy, do you want
to? Okay, yeah, I'll bring down the entry screen here and we can see our faces, and then let you go ahead and introduce.
Thanks, Troy. Hi, everybody. I'm Rick Sterling from Western IM, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the very first IMCanadaConnect presentation. The concept of IMCanadaConnect came from the very successful ARMA RIM month in April this year, when the Western Canadian chapters came together to present a presentation a week in April. The IMCanadaConnect initiative is an expanded effort to bring a year's worth of Canadian content to our records and information management community across the country. These presentations are brought to you by all the ARMA Canadian chapters and sponsored by Western IM. There is a group of chapter liaisons that will make sure that you all get information prior to the upcoming presentations that are coming. We welcome feedback from all of you along the way. All recorded presentations are supported and supporting information like slide decks will be posted on the IMCanadaConnect area on the Western IM website. As an example, Doyle, who you'll meet in a minute here, who's doing the very first presentation, has kindly agreed to allow his questions and the slide deck to be posted after this presentation. So thanks to the Halifax chapter, and particularly Doyle Lahey, our very first speaker in this initiative. And Doyle and I recorded his presentation last week, and we will be playing that recording, and then there will be time for live QA afterwards with Doyle. While you're thinking about questions, please use the chat or the QA at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen to ask your questions along the way that come to mind. I'll let Doyle introduce himself on the recorded presentation. Doyle, just want to say howdy to everybody before we start the recording.
Yeah, sure. Just want to say again, hi to everybody. My name is Doyle Lahey. I'm going to be giving the presentation today about information culture analysis. And just quickly, to not reiterate what I already say in the recording, thank you all for taking the time out today to come hear me speak about this very topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Doyle. And we're glad Doyle's here because, of course, he's in Halifax and the hurricane went through on the weekend. So he's still there. Anybody from the East Coast, I kept my fingers crossed for you all weekend just to make sure everything was okay. You'll also see Troy Sawyer on this exercise as well. Troy is also with Western IM. Troy is the development director for Western IM. And he actually is the guy that runs the webinar. So you'll see Troy, he saves my life all the time. Troy, if you want to fire up Doyle's presentation, that'll be great. And we'll be back live as soon as we do the recording. Thanks so much.
Great. I'll share my screen here for the recording and talk to everyone after.
Hello, everybody. My name is Doyle Lahey, and I'm here today to speak generally about information culture and more specifically about information culture analysis. And the subtext for the presentation is a user-centered approach to records and information management issues. Before I begin with the presentation, I just wanted to take the time out to thank everybody for taking the time to come and see me present and here talk about information culture and more specifically information culture analysis. Anytime I get to share my passion for this outlook on records management and philosophy on records management, it's always a pleasure. So I thank everybody for taking the time out of your day to hear me speak today. Before I get into the actual presentation, I just want to give a brief introduction into who I am. So my name is Doyle Lahey. I'm currently the Senior Corporate Records Analyst for the Information Services Division for the province of Nova Scotia, specifically the provincial government. I'm also Director for IMCanada in the Nova Scotia chapter. My own background comes from archives, libraries, museums, and I was also a records management educator for the Association of Municipal Administrators here in Nova Scotia. And I did at one point have a photograph of just my face here on the slide, but I decided to include a photograph of Cabot Links on what was actually a nice sunny day, which is, I think, a rarity there, but it was in July. So I just thought that photo was a little bit better. So for the presentation overview, I'll provide an introduction into the concept of information culture, including its definition, its origin, and how records management practitioners have utilized it in their own work. Then I'll speak about my own information culture analysis, which was conducted in 2021. It examines two departments whose records I was responsible for managing. I'll then move toward an overview of the practical implications and limitations of an information culture analysis, and then wrap up with final conclusions and then a question period. So what exactly is information culture? It's hard enough to define information and culture, and even harder to pin down an explanation that combines these two subjective terms. Furthermore, there are different definitions used by scholars, and they do overlap with each other. However, the definition of information culture that I find the most suitable is a philosophy that the attitudes, norms, and values that employees or individuals have towards information impact how it is managed. Now, I agree that this definition is broad in scope and can be interpreted in many different ways. That's why it's so subjective. But the fundamental takeaway about information culture is that it focuses on the relationship between cultures, so attitudes, norms, and values, but more specifically, the people who are creating and managing information, and the information itself. So you can deem this to be records, data, or information. The term itself came into the information studies realm around the 1980s, and it was used as a way to measure how employees' practices impacted business performances. So as a way to measure business matrix and performances. These researchers discovered that it's not technology that affects how information is managed, but rather the people who create the records, and that better technologies do not necessarily result in better information management environments. One early scholar of information culture, Miriam Ginman, concluded that information culture is a strategic goal and should be planned for as much as the transformation as physical resources. So indeed, information exists in all organizations, but the way employees value records and their attitudes towards it were not examined, nor were they understood. So this was a problem that they discovered. So information culture equals people. And now I'd like to just shift our attention to 2011 with Julie McLeod's landmark study, Accelerated Positive Change in Electronic Records Management. 3 of the headline findings from the study showed that few organizations have an articulated vision for electronic records management, or ERM. People, process, systems, and technological aspects are inextricably linked, and people issues are predominant, fundamental, and challenging. And they are predominant, fundamental, and challenging because they concern culture, philosophical attitudes, awareness of records management, and skills. So here's a popular saying, people are make or break a system, and it's wholly true because you can have the most advanced ERMS or advanced EDRMS, but if employees in your organization do not like it for whatever reason, there could be a multitude of reasons, they will not use it and the project will fail. Why is that? Because we don't attempt to understand the value individuals ascribe to records or their attitudes and behaviors towards it, but therein lies the fundamental problem. And here is a quote I like to use to sum up this problem, which is, observing how people have organized the world and the meanings they attach to what goes on in the world is difficult. Yes, it is very difficult, or it's not impossible. So this leads us to an important question when dealing with the hypothesis of information culture, which is there a way to identify information behaviors and values that can describe the information culture of an organization? How do you quantify it, and how do you qualify culture? The simple answer is yes, and it is through a 3-pronged approach. This is through data collection, either through a survey or interviews with staff, whether one-on-one or through a group meeting. An analysis based on certain categories that we're going to speak to in a minute. And a development of an information profile which describes the information culture of an organization. Several scholars and records management practitioners have employed this method to conduct an information culture analysis in their respective chosen organizations. I'm just going to list a few here. So Adrian Curry and Carolyn Moore, they did an information culture analysis of the National Health Service. Trudy Wright investigated the records management practices and training for the Ontario provincial government. Gillian Oliver investigated 3 universities in 3 separate countries. Chun-Wei Cho examined a few Canadian law firms. And Proscovia Savard investigated a Belgian municipality of a small and medium size. So these individuals also focused on different categories and asked questions in relation to each category in their assessment of an information culture. This was the first component of their analysis with respect to data collection. This component assists individuals to grapple with the difficulty of quantifying and qualifying information culture. So Adrian Curry, the components that they focused on for their methods of measurement were strategy and objectives, information, environment, information systems, relationships, and communications. Trudy Wright focused on communications, cross-organizational partnerships, confidentiality, professions, information, and the internal environment. Gillian Oliver focused on information as evidence, employee capabilities, and information governance. Fiorella Foscarini, who was not mentioned in the previous slide, but is nonetheless a practitioner of information culture analysis and a scholar as well of information culture, and actually collaborates quite frequently with Gillian Oliver. The components she focused on was information preference, awareness of environmental requirements, and governance. And Chu focused on integrity, formality, control, sharing, transparency, and proactiveness. So let's just go through two brief examples of how these scholars looked at information culture. So one of the leading scholars in information culture is Proskeria Savar, with numerous articles on the topic. In 2013, she conducted an analysis of a medium-sized municipality in Belgium with the following research question. What type of information culture exists in the municipality? So she focused and investigated on it with a very broad research question. And that's mostly what research questions are. They're very broad, but then you can get into the more specific as you get further results. But you wanted to start with a very broad scope in how to understand the information culture of this Belgian municipality. She conducted interviews with questions based on respect to information, skills, knowledge related to information management, and trust in organization information systems. So she based her investigation on the Oliver framework, and the results were that the municipality did not have an information/records management policy. There was no time to seriously engage with information management or records management problems. There was no system in place for records management training. A lot of individuals viewed records management as time-consuming. There was a we keep everything mentality, so they decided just to keep everything as opposed to following a retention period where they would keep the valuable information and discard the non-valuable. So at the end of it, the conclusion that she drew from her information culture analysis was that it was an underdeveloped information culture. So the second study, and this is a landmark study that is cited in many information culture works, and this is Adrian Curry and Carolyn's Moore 2003 article assessing the information culture of the National Health Service. And the reason why it's so important is because they set the standard for developing the conceptual model and appropriate metrics to measure the information culture of an organization. And they wanted to investigate the information culture of the NHS to provide senior management at the NHS to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the culture in that organization. They developed their quantitative questionnaire based on the following components. So communication, cross-departmental partnerships, appreciation of information value, information systems management, internal environment, information management, and professionalization. Their results showed that the NHS was aware of the value of information. However, the NHS is fragmented, with each board and department having its own culture. And I'm sure this rings true for many individuals here, is that the adoption of an information culture requires the senior management support with an emphasis on coordinated leadership rather than merely an imposition from the top down. Furthermore, and this is to an earlier point, the technological infrastructure to enable the free flow of information can be in place, but without cooperation of the managers and staff who are required to undertake the actual information sharing, the initiatives will fail. So after going through the information culture and information culture analysis, and also a few examples of scholars who have conducted analysis of their own, what I wanted to briefly talk about is my own starting point. It's how I actually came to investigate information culture in these two departments. So the first one was there was an ERMS proposal that I had put forth to these two departments, and it was declined. There had been a lot of work that went towards getting this proposal finished, and it seemed like a lot of individuals who were part of the proposal were really interested in pursuing an ERMS as a solution to the electronic records management systems problems that we were having, because everybody was saving documents in different places, and there was no sense of individuals doing things in a cohesive and standard manner. So when the ERMS proposal was declined, it was kind of a chink in the armor in terms of ways to help individuals who are struggling with electronic records management. Just speaking to this point too briefly that I already mentioned was inconsistent practices. People would be saving things in their Outlook, on the shared drive, or on SharePoint, or within OneDrive, so many different places, because there's so many different, what I like to call document warehouses where records can exist, and a lot of people were saving things all over the map, and there was no consistent practices. there was a real resistance to records management within each department. There may have been an understanding briefly about records management, but a lot of people were hesitant or didn't want to take on records management practices because they believed that it was an additional step that they had to take into the work processes that they were already deeply involved in. So it was something that was more cumbersome to them. So they showed resistance to the actual practices of records management. In relation to records management, a lot of misunderstanding and confusion. This would lead to the language around records management. So I can speak about the actual definition of a record, official records, transitory, functional classifications. There was a lot of confusion around what these terms actually mean and how they affect the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of people just didn't understand records management. And then last but not least was COVID-19. It was really hard in terms of making that transition from working in an office space to working at home, as some of us are actually still doing to this day. And it was just another step towards wanting to find a solution in terms of getting everybody on the same page in terms of managing their documents and especially electronic records. So that was the starting point of how I actually came to it. So bearing all those components in mind, I remember doing some research online to try to figure out an actual solution for how to tackle these issues I faced on a regular basis because it was kind of quite frustrating. And I came across the concept of information culture, and more specifically, information culture analysis. And after reading and examining many of the scholars who were previously mentioned in this presentation, I decided to develop a research method to examine the information culture of the departments whose records I was responsible for managing. The first step was to develop a 16-question survey, but there were more like statements where participants would mark if they strongly agree, unsure, disagree, and strongly disagree, so the Likert form questions. And the scores were allocated to the categories that I chose, which I'll speak to briefly in a moment. The central tendency was measured by mean and mode, which produced the same results. And before I go any further, there was also a 66% participation rate in the actual survey itself. So we got a lot of good data to work with. So yes, for my categories, I chose to model my system off Trudy Wright because she also examined a government organization, which I thought would be fitting for my environment. So the categories that I chose were strategy and objectives, environment, information systems, relationships, and communications. Before I delve into the results of the analysis, I want to provide a brief overview of the departments I examined. I also want to mention that each department was very happy to participate in this exercise, which was wonderful, and that it was promoted by the executive branch during departmental meetings. And I would strongly encourage this approach because most employees, would not have taken a survey if it was only supported by myself. So let's see here. So Department A, so 44 employees, so not a small department, but not a huge department. They have both a hierarchical classification for operational and administrative records. They're a service-based office, so they deal a lot with the public. The records management program started in 2017. There was some ad hoc records management practices before that, but they didn't formally establish the program until 2017. And they have 5 program functions. Department B, a little bit smaller, 19 employees, not as big as Department A. And they also have a hierarchical classification for operational and administrative records. They're more of a knowledge-based internal service. We also provide some consulting services for internal departments in terms of understanding how to follow certain policies and procedures. Their records management program was well established. They had probably had a records person for 15 plus years, so a lot of individuals who work in the department were very familiar with records management. And they have 4 program functions. So bearing that all in mind, let's get to the actual results. So let's focus first on the information category. So the statement is, quality information is critical for me to conduct my position's assigned tasks. So you can see there's Department A and Department B. So the results for this question were almost identical. Everyone's position was that quality information is required for them to conduct their work. So that's fantastic. Everybody is on the same page in terms of they need high quality information and records in order to conduct their work. So that's great. The second statement for the information category, I have access to all the information are required to work effectively. Sorry about that. So for Department A, the results were mixed, but more leaning towards agree and strongly agree. However, you can see a discrepancy in that a few participants did not have access to the information that they need to work effectively. And for Department B, most participants agreed with the statement, but a larger cohort was unsure. So you can actually see from the results here, unlike the first statement from information, that the second one, in terms of being able to have access to all the information you need to work effectively, the results were a little bit more mixed. So the strategy and objectives category, I am aware of the office's records management policy. So let's just put 2 here. So you can obviously see a difference between the 2 results. Now, while most individuals in Department B were familiar with the department's records management policy, Department A was not, with over 30% of participants indicating that they're not aware of the records management policy. Now, I can kind of chalk this up to the fact that Department A did not have a well-established records management policy until 2017, whereas Department B was a little bit more well-established in terms of their understanding of policies in relation to records management. So that's probably why there's a discrepancy between Department A and Department B. Information systems, the statement is, I'm confident using all the information systems to which I have access. So these information systems would include Outlook, SharePoint, OneDrive, Microsoft Access if it's used, and Network Drive. Several participants noted they felt confident in using these systems, which is interesting because it contradicts what I've heard from employees one-on-one. A lot of individuals would say that they find these systems a little bit confusing, or they're not intuitive, or they haven't had enough training in them. So the fact that a lot of participants here is saying that they felt confident using the systems was a surprise to me. But you do see a little bit more discrepancies in terms of people saying unsure, disagree, but overwhelmingly people either agree or strongly agree. The next category, which is environment, I feel confident in how I manage my information in my own work. You can see from the pie chart here, there's more mixed results, particularly for Department B, where the environment category. While many agreed, so 50%, like they felt confident managing their information at work, 43% were unsure. And for Department A, the majority agreed with the category statement in terms of they feel confident in how they manage information. But Department B, this wasn't the case. And again, this could be a reason. The reason why this could be is because the records management program wasn't as well established, but it's hard to say. But these are what the results are for the questionnaire on that end. Again, for environment, I can estimate my competency in records management to be one of the following. So this result was surprising to me because of what individuals tell me in terms of their knowledge of records management. You can see here that kind of Mountain Dew color on the pie chart. Almost everybody said intermediate, and everybody seems to have a good grasp on terms of their competency of records management. So it's really interesting when you do surveys like this and you get results like this, because you go in with assumptions and then you come out with results like this, which can be quite surprising. So everyone's felt quite confident in the competency of records management in the environment category. Last but not least is communications. I've taken part in records management training. You can see from the pie charts that the results were very mixed. The assumption I made is that some staff had either received records management training previous coming to work in government or with maybe another department, or received it when they came to my offices when I first started implementing a training regime, while others had just started working for government and hadn't enrolled or taken the time to pursue records management training. Either way, this is not the desired result for a rich information culture. You want to ensure that all individuals have the capacity to enroll in records management training and that they have taken it in order to understand the practices and policies that they're involved with. Another one for communications. So when I started my position, I was informed of the office's records management policies. Bring up both here. You can see, again, divided between results. And this was very troubling in my mind because records management is a part of every worker's responsibility and is something that needs to be taught and notified at the very beginning. However, as you can see from the results here, 50% and above of participants were not informed of their office's records management policies when they were started, which would lead them to create their own work habits in terms of how they store information. So there's not very many people who seem to be aware of the records management policies, as you see from the result of this category. And for the final statement, communications, I believe records management to be time-consuming. And this is for the communications category. A majority of the participants agreed with the statement, which I was not surprised about. And I wish I had a follow-up question for this category to describe why they believe records management to be time-consuming, but I could safely assume it is based on the premise that records management involves a series of steps, as I mentioned before, a series of steps separate from the work processes of many employees. So those were my results from the actual survey itself. So let's describe these results. So the first one, strategy and objectives, clear awareness of departmental records management policy and records retention. Many knew about the department's records management policy for the most part, and that records are kept for a certain amount of time, although there is room for improvement in terms of strategy and objectives. So there was a clear line that some people had a good idea of what the strategy and objectives in relation to records management policies were in their department, but there was definitely room for improvement. Invested in quality and accurate information. This was kind of a slam dunk. Quality information was an integral component to employees carrying out their daily tasks. Everybody was an overwhelming majority for that component. Confident in managing records and records management competency. There was an overwhelming majority of individuals who felt confident in their records management competency, which was, as I said before, a surprise to me. But if that's what the results are, then they speak for themselves. Information systems, confident in using the systems where information is created and stored and using the database and systems that employees have at their disposal. Not included actually in the slide deck was relationships, and sharing information is promoted between both departments. And the results show that each department was very encouraging of each other as the department as a whole in terms of sharing information, not only internally, but externally with certain parameters in place. And then finally, communications, and there was mixed responses with respect to understanding of records management in certain terms. So continuing on with the results of the survey, it highlighted to me that there were strong values for quality information and to manage information in the most effective manner. However, on the flip side, several employees were lacking a sense of competency in records management and subsequent policies, processes, and procedures. There was individuals who did feel confident in that, but the results were a little bit skewed in terms of they were showing people who did feel confident, but there was more people who were not confident in it, and which would explain why many individuals either exemplified inconsistent practices or complete ignorance of how to manage the records they create, which could also be linked to the gaps in records management training. There's also mixed attitudes about records management. Some employees viewed the validity of classifications and retention while others found it probably too confusing. And furthermore, I argued that it is important for records managers to understand the language they use by records creators, and not to assume that they understand the terminology used in archival science, because it cannot be very straightforward all the time. And results between Department A and Department B were very similar. There were some discrepancies between the two departments, but overall, there were a lot of similarities between them. So what are the strengths of an information culture analysis? Well, let's look at the first. The survey identified holes in the records management program, namely that training needed to be conducted on a regular basis, and that probably the language used to help individuals understand RM needs to be at their level. This means not to focus squarely on terms such as function, transaction, and transitory records, or even the official definition of a record, because it can be very subjective and can be interpreted in many different ways. So that's something to be cognizant of. Measurable results. The plan was to conduct another survey in the following year, and this is what I mean by measurable results. I could see how things have changed within a year if I focus squarely on the issues presented in information culture analysis. However, I have since moved on to another position, so I cannot conduct another information analysis on this department, which is unfortunate because I would have liked to. Another strength is varying degrees of understanding. So the analysis showed that there were varying degrees of understanding in terms of records management with each organization. This I interpreted as a strength because I couldn't concretely surmise what level of comprehension of records management my colleagues had. And I can now safely assume that everyone is at a different level in terms of records management literacy. So as opposed to me just making assumptions, I have the concrete evidence and data at my disposal, and I can decide how to take that forward. Finally, the analysis provided a path forward for an improved records management culture, because I knew with the results of the survey, which to hone my focus on, so the results provided me with kind of like a North Star where to put my attention towards, rather than continuing on with projects that would not be fruitful and not be an endeavor worthwhile going through. I'll speak more about the strengths in detail at the summary portion of this presentation, but the strengths are survey identified holes in the program, measurable results, saw that there's varying degrees of understanding and a path forward for improved records management culture. Now, with any type of survey or study, there's going to be weaknesses. So the line of questioning needs improvement. So I would have asked more direct questions and different statements in this survey in relation to records management, and more follow-up questions rather than broader queries from each category. Furthermore, I would have conducted one-on-one interviews with employees as opposed to just doing the survey, and then maybe also have more group involvement, whether it to be certain divisions within the department or just one-on-one with individuals from each division of the department. Lack of research questions. So I didn't have a series of research questions, but more of an exploratory mindset of what is the information culture of these offices, mostly because the concept and the form of an analysis was new to me. So it's something that I would like to hone in more, would be to get more specific questions as the results start to come through. The Likert style of questions, they're easy to analyze if the results fall within one end of the spectrum, strongly agree or disagree, or unsure or agree or strongly disagree. But when they're all over the place, it's difficult to ascertain one true response. So the Likert style of questions do work very well, but I think there is some room for improvement in terms of measuring the actual results of the survey. Other cultural variables, so language, education, and previous experiences. I did not want to include other key components of culture, such as the ones that I just listed, because they're a little bit too personable. And if you get to the point where you're extrapolating that type of information, it could become an issue in terms of privacy and ethics as well. So I didn't include those cultural variables. So it could be seen as a weakness, but also something that you can't really include because it contains too much personal information. And finally, can culture be defined? It's a fluid concept, and the information culture of today may change tomorrow. And it is really hard to identify and define what culture is. I think in terms of information culture and information culture analysis, the definition is quite narrow and within focus, but it is possible that culture is really hard to define because it's such a fluid concept. So that's another weakness in terms of information culture and information culture analysis. But what I really want to focus on is the practical implications of an information culture analysis. So bring it all together. Let's now shift our focus to the practical implications. And there are a few implications that I want to explain. So the first is measure the attitudes and values of employees about records and information management. So first, this is achievable through yearly surveys to employees and initiatives which target areas or categories where employees expressed a lack of understanding. So for example, if one year the information culture analysis shows that few individuals understood or know about the records management policy of their workplace, and then increased communication and training occurs throughout that year, the following survey may show a greater understanding and more value about said policy. So in that sense, you can measure how practices, attitudes, and values have changed due to an increased focus on those specific areas. You can actually measure the changes that are happening on a yearly basis. The second practical implication will be used as an analytical tool to provide practitioners with insight and sensitivity to the context of their workplace. For the most part, records managers, we work in isolation. We are primarily known as the individuals who take care of records once employees are done with them, rather than being involved at the beginning before record creation. It's not true for everybody. For the majority of records managers, it is. An information culture analysis can provide records managers with an analytical tool to provide them with insight into the context of their workplace, which is key and so valuable, and show, with respect to the example of, that records management is about more than handling records once they are no longer needed, but rather that we can provide help and guidance for both paper and electronic records, and potentially garner expanded relationships within our own organization and strengthen our positions within those institutions. Furthermore, managers might wish to consider understanding the information culture of their organization to have a sense of the information attitudes and values that are important to their organization. We always hear about things in terms of a work culture and how to improve a work culture. Well, that's so important. And if we create, maintain, and organize information on a daily basis, and everybody does it within an organization, why is it not worthwhile to also investigate the information culture as well? Identify gaps in records management training. So training employees is an important component for effective records management practices. These sessions provide employees with the knowledge and practical examples they need in order to maintain valuable records. An information culture analysis can help identify gaps in training sessions and more specifically how to improve communication through an organization on important records management practices. Filling these gaps will inherently improve the organization's information culture. So yeah, if we have a robust system in place in terms of records management training, the records management or the information culture of that organization will inherently improve and become much richer. Finally, practical implication number 4, shift focus away from information creation and usage to the ways in which people behave and their inherent values and attitudes. As records managers, we are mostly focused on records creation and usage, mainly because it is such a significant portion of our job. And we are the ones responsible for managing those records, so it's no wonder that that's where we hone our focus in on. However, we also need to understand the values and attitudes that employees have towards the records that they create, to have a greater understanding of why they do what they do, and how these attributes affect the information culture of an organization, which an information culture analysis can provide. So let's bring it all together for the final summary. So as research has shown, people issues have a significant impact on records management, but they are challenging because they concern culture and philosophical attitudes of individuals that are rarely examined nor understood. Information culture, which is a concept that the attitudes, norms, and values employees have towards records impact how they are managed, and the subsequent analysis that explores these issues helps shift the focus away from compliance systems to engaging with end users and focusing more on the human element of records management. As noted by Julian Oliver, a scholar of information culture, imposing systems and procedures that only work in theory and that they have been developed without paying attention to actual work practices and the attitudes and values of employees leaves both the records keepers and end users dissatisfied and can engender dysfunctions in an organization. So we got to shift the focus away from mainly on records creation to more about end users. And I think that would be a huge leg up for us. And yes, an information culture analysis can pivot our attention away from imposing systems and procedures to target the ways in which people behave and their inherent values. And with a stronger understanding of information culture through an analysis, limitations are identified and management will be better informed on how to develop strategies for several different initiatives. And this can include digitalization projects, composition of a strategy and improvement plan, and an ERMS by itself can be considered a form of culture because it's associated with a value system that can either conform or conflict with the values upheld by stakeholders. And finally, for the last component here, we will enhance and improve our understanding of working environments by including the input of employees. We can't keep working in isolation and focusing on records themselves. We need to extend the conversation to everyone because we can't do this alone, especially considering the constant creation of electronic records and all of the systems that are being created and that employees have to use on a daily basis. And if we do continue on with our current practices and pushing for compliance in terms of silo ERMS and policy-driven conversations that do not include the cultural differences of our respective organizations, we truly do run the risk of becoming irrelevant. An information culture analysis opens the door to a new realm of possibility, and one that I would argue is well worth exploring. And that's the end of my presentation. I again thank everybody here for coming to listen to me speak about information culture and specifically information culture analysis. And yeah, we can just open the floor to questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Doyle. Well, you know, I have to say that Doyle and I recorded this presentation last week, and I mean, I heard it last week, Doyle, and I thought it was really good last week, but I heard it again today, and it was even better. So just a tip for everybody: if you get a chance to go back and listen to it again, it's probably going to be even better. I'm sure that's going to happen. So just I want to get this straight, because you said that there's no problem with giving or allowing us to post the questions you asked, Doyle, the survey you did with these two departments.
No, not at all.
As part of this. Well,
Yeah.
I think that's really going to be great. I think personally, I'm very interested in the topic myself, because we've been kind of doing implementation of EDRMS systems and records management systems for over 25 years. And it's usually the people, the users they're the biggest kind of roadblock in these situations.
No, absolutely.
Going forward.
The funny thing is, too, before this presentation, I had a meeting with one of the departments in the province that I'm an advisor for, and they were talking about, like, we're having a lot of trouble with our shared drive. People seem to be following like certain practices that we implemented, and we just want to have an ERMS implemented because we think it will change everything. And I had to say to them, like, no, it's more like, let's just focus on the people and see what they're doing and how they're classifying things, or if they're not, and get a real sense of the culture of the environment that they work in. And they were like, well, what do you mean by culture? And then it like kind of elicited the same conversation, not
Right.
to this extent, but and they're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think just kind of pivoting that standpoint is really helpful.
Yeah, one of my partners, one of Troy's and my partner, Daryl Schrader, who's actually on the webinar today. One of Daryl's favorite expressions in a humorous kind of way is, if it wasn't for the end users, we could have had this rolled out in a week.
It's very true.
So I don't see any questions in the chat window right now, and I think that's probably because everybody's kind of mulling all of this over. Like I personally had never thought of this before, and I had never followed any kind of cultural analysis before, so I didn't really know about the topic. So we got a question. How often should records management training occur?
Yeah, I see that they're ongoing or just for filling gaps or only no employees. It's a really good question. One way I can answer it is, so when I first started working with the department whose records management program was started in 2017, so everybody was kind of at the baseline in terms of their records management understanding. I started doing training. So I do, so there's divisions within each department. So I would do training for each division. And then, so that would be maybe once a month. And if there, I would say in terms of how often it should occur, is how often and how frequently staff turnover happen a lot, because a lot of people will be coming on and they'll be getting onboarded with the system or just in data with a lot of information. But it's a lot of things that don't occur when a new employee starts is they don't receive records management training. So I would say probably every time you have at least like 2, 3, or 4 new individuals coming into the program itself, and just do like a kind of like something that's a little bit more informal, get a sense of what their understanding of records management is, and then more higher level in terms of like what classification is, how those types of systems work within the department, and the agreed upon policies and procedures for that department. And another thing I would say too, when I first started training, I was doing a lot of records management lingo that people within the environment understand. And then I was getting like a lot of confused faces in terms of like, what's the hierarchical classification system? And then if you bring it down to describing it kind of like a library system or another system that has good organization, like maybe something like, I always use Home Depot for whatever reason, and that seemed to stick with people because they could find things easily there. Whereas opposed to like, if you're trying to find something, you go to Costco or Dollarama and you're just kind of swirling around in the store and you can't find anything. That's a good example of poor classification or the way things are organized. So yeah, the answer to that question would say whenever you get a new batch of employees or there are a few new employees starting, and then just bring the training down to their levels so what they can actually understand.
A couple of more questions coming in now. And I've kind of remember the last 25 years anyway, we've tried to get HR involved in some of this kind of front end new hire environments that we're all our clients were in, is get them involved in trying to help with the training side of things, or at least specify that training needs to be done, because a lot of organizations just didn't do that. There wasn't a lot of training with the new hires that came in the door. And quite frankly, a lot of employees that have been there for a very long time had really never been trained or had been trained very poorly over the years. And I don't think that was any responsibility of the records management community necessarily. It was like a corporate culture thing. It just happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only like, I think this is a systemic problem too within the provincial government, is that not only do they receive like records manager training, but also like the most fundamental training in terms of like benefits and what their pension is. They just kind of start and then they get in with their projects that they're onboarded for, something like that. And everything else kind of slips to the side. And then you get to the point where you have so much information that you don't know how to handle it, or you don't know what to do with it, or something happens with your pension, or you need to know more about your benefits. So I think a lot more training could be involved, specifically for records management, because we create information all the time.
And another question here, Doyle, as well. And are you seeing this? Have you got your chat open there? Are you looking at these
I do.
questions?
Yeah. Were there aspects of the information culture that you identified you wanted to change, or did you have the opportunity to try? What did you do? People's beliefs. Yeah, the really unfortunate part of doing this information culture analysis was that I ended up going to another department afterwards, so I didn't actually get to follow up on things, but I could see like little micro changes in terms of communication. So one thing that I did once I found out that a lot of people were having trouble with records management terminology was to release each month what I call records management bulletins. And they would have like this short descriptor, one page about a particular records management practice, maybe say digitization or scanning, or what exactly a record is, or the relationship between a freedom of information request and records management, how the two coalesce together. And I did see a lot of benefit from that because individuals are saying to me, it's great to actually have a one-page document that I can quickly peruse through and understand. Whereas, like, if I go into a manual that's 100 pages and then I'm going to see it buried deep down in some language that I don't find helpful, it's much easier to have information that's quick, succinct at their disposal. So I think that's one component of information culture. I'd probably put that into the communication realm and also training. That really helped with individuals. So that was one component that I definitely saw a fruitful result from.
If you want to hear, I'll read the next question. You mentioned that RM is difficult to staff for staff because it's a series of steps outside their daily tasks for employees. Could you elaborate on this? So the kind of stuff that people are having to do to adhere to the RM policies that isn't what your job is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, that's a great question. So one example I could give is, so say there's something like a policy analyst, and what they're doing on a day-to-day basis is doing a lot of research, reading emails, and attending meetings. And in terms of processes, say if they're actually going through the development of a new policy, primarily they're using Word documents and then having meetings with individuals and editing these policy documents on a day-to-day basis. And then separate from that, what they would have to do is to put this into maybe a separate folder within the shared drive or into Outlook with another shared folder with their employees. And we didn't have the capabilities in terms of like what an ERMS is to enforce retention and disposition. Sorry, that's my doorbell going off. I'm not sure who's here, so sorry about the background noise. So in those terms, it's a separate process from what they're actually doing because they're narrowly focused on the policy itself. It makes sense because it's a part of their work, but it would be really hard for them to say, not hard, but it would be another added step for them to, once they add it to the shared drive, then to implement whatever the retention period is and to figure that out and to figure when the active close state is, if it's semi-active or if it's ready for disposition. So that would be a separate work process that is different from what a regular policy analyst is. At least that would be my take from it.
Just to tie it back to the survey that you were doing, some of the questions there you asked were kind of geared towards if you were to do this and adhere to kind of what we're doing for records management, do you feel it would be a benefit? So even though there are some extra steps in a lot of people's systems, tying it back to kind of your questions, a lot of people in the results you showed do feel that it's important.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think this is one of the difficult things too that I didn't really get to explore because things that I've heard from other people in other organizations who have implemented an ERMS, sometimes they could have many different steps in terms of the metadata that you have to log in for an actual document itself. I think one person said they had 100 options for metadata logins for an ERMS. And then a lot of people would be like, I don't think I want to do this, so I'm not going to use the system. I'm just going to go about my own way of actually doing it. So I think that could be another example of that. But yeah, Troy, your point is definitely well taken.
Yeah, that would be to me that 100 metadata pieces. That would be a disaster looking for a place to happen. most of our clients.
No, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
All right, so Rick, right here, kind of at the top of the hour, do you want to maybe sum up the presentation and we'll let people go?
Yeah. Thanks, Troy. Doyle, so thank you so much for bringing this topic forward. And I would say to everybody on the seminar on the webinar this morning, please, if you have a presentation that you think might be really interesting to our group of records and information management people across the country, our community, please contact your chapter, your ARMA chapter, and bring it forward to your chapter president or your program people, because each chapter in this kind of series of webinars will be bringing forward at least one presentation to the group as a whole. So that's the kind of the goal, is every chapter brings forward one presentation at least to the national kind of program that we're putting together here, the IMCanadaConnect program. So if you have something you think is really interesting for the group, please bring it forward to your program or chapter people. If you're not an ARMA member, please join ARMA. It's a wonderful thing to do, and we want to keep our culture together. It's been 2 tough years for all of us to not be together in person. So everything we can do to stay together as a community is important. So please stay tuned. You'll get information out of your chapter liaisons sometime soon for the next presentation for October. I believe Edmonton will be doing that presentation, putting that presentation forward. And thank you all for joining today, and everybody stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody in the next presentation. Thanks again, Doyle, for your help.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Rick, I just want to say to other individuals, if you are still, this idea is still percolating in your mind, and then you have questions later, you can contact me at doyle.lahey@novascotia.ca if you have any follow-up questions.
Okay. We'll be sending out an email with all the content from today's presentation as well. And we'll have it all posted with your email there as well. So if you didn't get that, you'll get an email soon with presentation posting from the entire recording, slides, and questionnaires and stuff as well.
Perfect. That's excellent.
Thanks, everybody.
Great.
Have a
Thank
great
you, everyone.
rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye now.
Take care.
Bye.